Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar and launch of our Asina Loyiko website. My name is Leanne Govinsamy, and I head the Corporate Accountability and Transparency Program at the Center for Environmental Rights. I welcome you today from a very warm Johannesburg. I hope that you're all well. We're really excited with the panel that we have today for the discussion that we have ahead of us. These are really tough issues to discuss and you know, to kind of share experiences on as well. But we really welcome you, and we hope that you will participate by asking questions, engaging with the panelists that we have here today. I'm going to quickly hand over to my colleague Khalil, who will tell you a little bit more about the Asina Loyiko campaign, as well as the website, and will take us very briefly through the website before we move forward into the program that we have for the panel discussions. Khalil Moses is the coordinator of the Asina Loyiko campaign, Center for Environmental Rights. Khalil, over to you.
All right, good morning all, and welcome to the Asina Loyiko campaign's website launch and the anti-SLAPP suit webinar. As Leanne mentioned, I'm the campaign coordinator for Asina Loyiko. So around the world, you know, human rights activists are subjected to immense physical and judicial harassment. Their important work in protecting human rights and the environment, all in the public interest, is regularly met with reprisal and attacks on their person, property, and basic rights, most often by corporate actors. In support of the anti-SLAPP campaign, Asina Loyiko, and as part of the launch of the campaign website, local and international experts will be sharing their views today on SLAPPs and corporate bullying at a time when meaningful strategic partnerships to resist corporate intimidation is more important than ever before. This discussion aims to empower civil society actors, provide strategic insights, and help build a global alliance of resistance. As part of our efforts to resist the attempts by corporate and state actors to intimidate, silence, and scare human and environmental rights defenders, we have built an anti-SLAPP suit website. This website will be serving as a resource hub and coordination tool for environmental rights and human rights defenders who are facing intimidation, bullying, and violence for their activism in South Africa, Africa, and around the world. Activists, media, and the concerned public around South Africa will be able to use this tool to learn more about SLAPP suits, what kinds of effects this is having on our freedom of speech, and what other threats activists are facing, and how we can mobilize to fight these dirty bullying tactics. All right, so I'm just going to share my screen and just very briefly walk you through the website. Can everyone see the Asina Loyiko website?
Yes, we can. Yes. Thank you, Khalil.
Okay. Great. All right, so here's the Asina Loyiko website. As you can see, we've got a homepage with a report bullying form. And this is aimed at collating information on you know, what kinds of bullying activists are facing in South Africa for research purposes. So if I show you, just take you to this form. So basically anyone, if they've faced any kind of bullying or intimidation, will be able to come onto the Asina Loyiko website, be able to fill in a brief form. If they want to remain anonymous, they can just check this box, and they won't have to fill in you know, details like their first name, last name, email address, mobile number, organization, that kind of thing. But they will also be able to let us know who the bully is in this case, and what kind of bullying and intimidation they're facing. So whether it be a SLAPP suit, whether you know, they've faced violence or death threats, or you know, that kind of thing. We also have, just go back to the home page. We also have a join the movement form. And this is aimed at building a strong collective movement with the Asina Loyiko campaign, getting people involved in the campaign, having them provide us with their email addresses, what organization they're part of, or whether they're just a concerned citizen, and allowing us to regularly communicate with them, provide them with campaign updates, let them know if there's a campaign event happening or protest, how they can support other activists who've been hit with slap suits, that kind of thing. So that's the join the movement form. And it will also just be, your first name, your last name, what organization you're part of, your email address, that kind of thing. We also have a resource hub, and this is the largest part of the Asina Loyiko website, and its sort of main purpose in providing activists with tools and information on slap suits and other threats that human rights and environmental rights defenders are facing. So stuff on, if you'd like to learn about what a slap suit is, you can come here and learn about what slap suits are, what kind of effect they're having on the freedom of speech in South Africa. Specifically, if you would like information about slap suits in South Africa, we've got information on the current slap suits that South African NGOs and other activists are facing. We've got information on slap suits around the world, and how they're being used around the world to intimidate and silence activists. We've also got here resources on slaps, which are mainly reports. So reports from Global Witness, reports from the Center for Applied Legal Studies, reports from Greenpeace, and from a whole bunch of other organizations on, there's also a UN Special Rapporteur report on the situation of human rights defenders. And these are all resources, again, on what kind of threats environmental rights and human rights defenders are facing around the world, how this manifests around the world. Specifically with the Global Witness report, for instance, it goes into detail on how many human rights and environmental rights defenders were killed in 2019 for protecting their environment. We've also got case studies, and again, this is just more information on the kinds of slap suits, the kinds of threats and intimidation, the kinds of tactics that are being deployed by corporate and state actors against environmental rights defenders. As more webinars and other information comes out on slap suits and protecting the right to protest, fighting back against corporate bullying comes out, we'll also be posting them here on the webinar resources hub. Currently, we've got a webinar that was hosted by ICAR up here on the site. There's also a resource for basically an investor's guide to corporate accountability and transparency. So what you can do as an investor in a corporate corporate entity, what you can do to ensure that that company isn't deploying slap suits against environmental rights defenders, or if they are, or deploying other kinds of intimidation tactics, what you can do as an investor, how you can pressure that company, and how you can ensure that that company puts in place better corporate accountability and transparency policies. As more media comes out about the Asina Loyiko campaign, that will also be posted here. And then we've also got some information on our funding and some other resources for anti-slap work and anti-slap tactics. Yeah, that's pretty much most of the site. There's also a donate button that will allow anyone visiting the site to donate to the Asina Loyiko campaign. And that money will then obviously just be used for the Asina Loyiko campaign. And that's
Thank you, Khalil. Thank you, Khalil. I think it's so important to note that, we've built the site in response to so many calls from activists here in the region, globally, to be able to better understand SLAP suits in South Africa, to be able to understand what does SLAP mean in a particular region, but also collate resources and information for people to develop anti-SLAP strategies. And so much of what we have on the site is really based on the amazing work that our partners have done in collecting information, in being able to look at what are the best strategies to combat SLAP. And we hope in the near future to have our own South African anti-SLAP handbook, and we're working hard at making that a possibility. And I really do want to emphasize that this is a resource and a hub that is held and owned by civil society in South Africa as part of the Asina Loyiko campaign. So we encourage you to share with us what you want to see on the website. Share with us the resources for legal representation that you come across, for physical protection of activists that you come across. We've listed the Southern African Human Rights Defenders Network as an important link on the site, and we have Stanley representing the right to protest, as well as being a steering committee member on the Human Rights Defenders Network, who'll tell us more about this work. But we thought it was really important to be able to connect not only the resources for the legal defense of SLAP, but how do you also ensure physical protection? And speaking about physical protection and the importance of, as a first form of defense, ensuring that activists are their physical safety, the physical safety of their families, is the number one and top priority. I'd like to introduce you to Nonhle Umbutuma from the Ahmediba Crisis Committee. Nonhle is, our local hero and activist. She fights for land and environmental rights in South Africa's Eastern Cape. In 2007, she founded the Ahmediba Crisis Committee to unite community members in the 5 villages of the Ahmediba Tribal Authority region to work together in opposition to destructive mining projects. As a result of the work that she's done, and really very unfortunately in 2008, she survived an assassination attempt. In the past years, she's reported constant death threats. These have escalated since 2015, when the entire coastal community organized itself against an open cast mine planned for the Ahmediba coast. And in March 2016, Nonhle's colleague and chair of the Ahmediba Crisis Committee, Bazuka Khadebe, was killed shortly after telling Nonhle and another colleague that he was number 1 on a hit list and that they were numbers 2 and 3. And this crime to date remains unsolved, and today Nonhle is still facing continuous incredible death threats. And so we're so privileged today to have Nonhle available to us today to be able to speak about how, in resisting activist repression, in resisting harmful mining activities. Nonhle, we welcome you. We thank you for the work that you've done, and we would love for you to share your story and your advice to activists around the country that are facing similar repression.
Good morning to all of you. I'm sorry, I'm not a technology person. I was struggling a little bit to find my mute. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. Yes, yeah, my name is Nonhle, as she's already been introduced me. I'm from here in Pondoland, which is Eastern Cape. Yeah, we facing quite a lot of pushed by so-called development for many years. And for us, it's not something new because we are taking over from something what was happening from our own grandfathers, where they were fighting the same fight. Even today, we still fighting the same fight that our forefathers, they were fighting in 1950s, which is very surprising. Yeah, it's very, very painful because when you fight for distractions in your community, you sacrifice your life, you sacrifice your family, you do everything in order to make sure that things goes right. Here in Kolobeni, since the Australian company arrived here and they discovered the minerals, we never rest. And if I can tell you, they just arrived like early 1996. But even today, we never rest. Instead, we're losing comrades on the spot. For example, since we formed Ahmediba Crisis Committee, our late chairperson was being murdered. When they were trying to, some officials, they were trying to bribe him, and he refused to take bribe, which is very important for activists because this is how they divide us. This is how they kill the activism, because when they put the money in front of us, they think when you have money, you have everything. Once you take money, you sell out your people, you sell out your pride. But our late chairperson, which is Bazoa Khatebe, refused to sell his own soul and his own people. That is why his situation, it didn't go the way it was supposed to be, because some of activists, they take money and they just disappear. And after he was being murdered in 2016, we're hoping that the investigation will go according to like any other people that the police are going to do the investigation. As today, there's no findings, there's nothing. But some of us that were still left behind, we're still living under the threat. We're still living where we've been pushed to be silenced, where we've been accused of we are anarchists in our communities. We don't want development. And they were trying to push us where the police, they push the police, they use our police system that they must intimidate the activists. That's how the tactics the government, when they are working with these big companies, do in our communities, to work, to use our police system to intimidate the activists. But unfortunately, we are not intimidated because we know that the land is ours and the land is everything. Once we just been accepted to be intimidated, that means we give them a chance to take it over. But we said that this country, this is a democratic country. We cannot be bullied and we cannot be voiceless. That's what we're saying as an activist. And we know that these mining companies, they are taking quite a lot of activists, like in Lutzville, in Tormin, where people, they cannot speak freely about the mining company, how they do. To say that if you said that MRC is doing this and that, and then the next thing, what you're going to do as an activist, you just receive a fine where they said that you speaking bad about them, you need to pay a so-called defamation of character. I don't know, honestly, what is defamation character means, because if you are doing something bad, I need to tell people that what you're doing, it's bad. And it doesn't make sense to me that we can be silenced by these big companies of so-called defamation character. How did it help us? Because we have so many cases in South Africa where the activists that are being murdered, where the activists are being intimidated, they're not going anywhere. But when it comes to these mining companies, we can see that their cases are taken seriously than the activists. That's what we always request to our own government, that we need to be treated by the same. They must not put the profit first than the people. We are the people and we are the voters of South Africa. Why they always put the South Africa, I mean, these companies first? And we understand that this economy, it's economy because of what they, I mean, the country, it needs the economy in order to make the country to be better. But we cannot compromise our environment just for making the economy better, because it's the same where you compromise your livelihood, your way of life in order for somebody to survive. We cannot do that. As we're speaking right now, in Kolobeni, we survive through the land. The land we utilize for agriculture, we utilize the ocean, we utilize everything in a sustainable way. But right now you can see how they push the community out of the land and promise them the jobs. But the question you must ask yourself, if the mining company, it creates quite a lot of jobs, why South Africa is so high rate of unemployment, as South Africa have so many mines? Why we have so many contaminated water in South Africa? Why we have so many dongas in South Africa? Why we have so many mines that are left open in South Africa? If the mining, it's an option, it's an alternative. Right now, as an activist, we said that to our government, let's put a sustainable development. Let's include when we talk about economy. And I was listening the speech of the president right now when they're talking about the recovery economy. And you can even see they're just talking about the short term, which is it's not going to solve the problem of unemployment in South Africa. That is why we said that this bullying of pushing the activists, and it's not only the activists that are on the ground, also the lawyers, those lawyers that are defending the poor people on the ground, they've been arrested, they've been harassed, they've been intimidated. And I was surprised in Kolobeni where the human rights, the very known lawyer, which is Richard Spoor, was being arrested in front of us because he was defending us that we cannot be blocked, we cannot be pushed by the police because we have a right to put our own opinions. Because when the development is come to our community, we have a right to decide what kind of development we want. But it's seemingly in this government, there is no right for communities. The only right is for the government and the companies. That is where, as activists, we push that those rights, the right to choose, the right to decide, must be respected, must be acknowledged by our own government. Otherwise, we'll push back and forward because we cannot be silenced because of this intimidation. And we know that we've received quite a lot of intimidation by SMS, and some they try us to poison us, and some they try to bribe us to get the better position from the local municipalities. But it doesn't solve the problem. The problem here is that we want the justice on the ground. If the development is for the people, must come clean and must come clear, and we want a transparency, because all these mining companies, there is no transparency. You can go anywhere. Transparency is something else. That is why the new case that we won as Ahmediba Crisis Committee, where we just said that the communities must have an access to information before the mining application must be granted. They must see what is the mining application contain. Because it never been bothered the politicians that the community, they know what is the mining company apply for, as long they said that they're going to create jobs. That is why as an activist, we said that no matter how difficult, but we push. And also environment, which is Mother Earth. Right now, we are facing with the global warming. We are facing with the climate change. where we see the weather is extremely hot and it's very dry, but nobody talks about that. Instead, everybody's speaking about how can we create jobs, but never think of the more we destroy the Mother Earth, the more we destroy our lifespan. That is why we said that yes, we want development, but we want development that is going to go together with our Mother Earth, because as human beings, in order for survive, we depend on environment. Yes, we know that environment can survive without as human being, but us as human being, we cannot survive without environment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Najle. Such an incredibly powerful testimony to communities being able to determine what development means to them. I really want to check in with colleagues on this call if you have any questions for Najle at this point. But Najle, from my side, you know, I see we have a question from Charlie. Charlie Holt from Greenpeace, and he's saying, would be very interested to hear how government and state authorities work to facilitate the intimidation, harassment, bullying of activists by company. So how government is able to engage police forces. Najle, you've experienced this firsthand. It's not just the corporation acting by itself, right?
Yes. You know, yeah, if we said how government cooperating with work with these companies and using the police for harassment, I can give you an example. Here in Kolobeni, when the mining company is supposed to do a public consultation, you see, this is a public consultation. Where the mining companies, they're supposed to come and do consult people, but we never be free. When these mining companies, they come, they brought quite a lot of number of police. How come on the public consultation, you bring thousands of police? This is an intimidation. That means people cannot speak freely. Because police are here, you don't know what can you say, because you know that I might be arrested today if I say something, because you don't know what, how can you put your words in a way that it cannot step somebody's toes. You know, that's where they started. From the public consultation, they brought quite a number of police, and it doesn't make sense to me if you said this is a public consultation, where the police involved on top of that. And beside that, even the ministers, when they come, and we've experiencing here in Kolobeni many times, when the ministers themselves, they are coming to say they are coming to consult us, but they brought thousands of police. And where we just see that it's really, really difficult. And also they brought in, they burst in the people from outside in order to make us that we are few than the people that they brought. That is an intimidation that is done by the government, because you can't just bring somebody from somewhere else like what they've done, where they were busing people from Port Elizabeth, busing people from Mthatha to Kolobeni to do what? That's how the government is doing all this intimidation. And we see that beside intimidation, it's a divide and rule, because what we're going to do, instead of fighting the right person, we'll end up fighting against each other, because we're asking those people that are not living and are not directly affected, what are you doing here? Because we haven't given the mining company a go-ahead. You see, that is why I said it's a two-way. It's a divide and rule and a harassment at the same time. For example, when the Minister Gwede Mantashe was here in Kolobeni, all the types of police were present, and you can see that the way they brought the police, TRT, SAPS, with the hoses, and you can see that this is a war, ambulances and all sorts of stuff, that they are in a war. We are in a, I don't know how can I put in English, because if we are in a negotiations, why you bring such a force in the rural community like ours in Kolobeni? That is why we are saying that when they push these mining companies to take over in our communities, they use the police system in order to intimidate our communities. But we're not going to be intimidated, no matter how they do it, because last time when the minister was here, myself, I was being tear gassed by the police that have been brought in the public consultation, and I was even wonder what was the police doing, and I didn't do anything, and I was just being tear gassed, and I was almost being damaged. Those are the kind of intimidation that we are talking about. Because when police they come, they've been told they must be targeted in this public consultation. You can see that they are targeting some activists amongst us.
Thank you so much, Nonhle.
Thank you.
We really appreciate you sharing this and just your immense courage in dealing with these issues head first. Nonhle, we'd love for you to remain on the call to be able to participate as we go along, but we also understand if you need to leave the call as well. We will certainly ensure that the strategies that you have had to painstakingly develop over the years are shared on our Asina Loyiko website so that other activists have access to understanding what strategies they can use, and also so that activists feel part of a group in South Africa that is part of a campaign that can be able to support each other in this way. Thank you, Nonhle. I'm going to change things up a little bit in the program, especially given what Nonhle has just said in terms of the role of state forces, the role of protest, how victimization and harassment can really come to bear on the important work that activists are doing in South Africa. So I'm going to start with the panel that features a number of South African organizations, organizers, and I'm going to be able to just go into very quickly what is SLAP and corporate intimidation in South Africa, and how can we protect and advance constitutional rights through resistance, campaigning, and solidarity. I want to move straight away to Tommy Nkosi from the Right to Know. He is the Countering Repression organizer. And Tommy, the question that I have for you as you kick off the panel discussion this morning is, what is the impact of SLAPs and corporate intimidation on freedom of speech and expression? And perhaps, Tommy, you can also reflect on some of what Nonhle has shared with us today in terms of your own experiences in helping activists to try and really stand strong in the face of this kind of repression. Tommy, please go ahead. And for everyone's benefit, all the panelists, including Nonhle as the keynote speaker, their bios and further information is being posted in the chat. Tommy, over to you.
Thank you so much, Leanne. I think, thank you so much as well for Nonhle for kind of sort of painting such a beautiful picture. And I think quite often when we have these discussions, we hardly ever pay attention to the experiences of the people that are at the cold face of, such, tyranny that is actually unleashed on our citizens and unleashed on our communities by these corporate companies. And I think I want to start off by saying I really admire the courage and the strength that Nonhle has to resist as much as he has over the years. And I think we need to critically think about how best we support our activists that find themselves in the firing line, so to speak. And I think it's a good question. And for me, perhaps maybe just to kind of break the ice, to simply say, it's not necessarily what we're seeing in Kolobeni is the only thing that is happening. What we're seeing is a trend in this country, essentially, of slap suits, or what we call, at least within the Right to Know campaign, what we call the use of lawfare to scare and intimidate activists from demanding greater accountability, from demanding that they participate in certain processes and decision-making processes that, you know, are going to affect their lives. What we've seen is an offshoot of that actually escalating into other different sectors as well. We're commonly seeing a lot of institutions interdicting even workers to a large extent, and even targeting individuals who may stand to defend the human rights of certain communities or certain individuals within communities or activists within communities that find themselves at the cold face of actually being corporate bullied. And I think there's a couple of lessons in history in our country as well. When you think about Marikana, for example, shows us just how you would have politicians colluding with corporate, you know, institutions to essentially clamp down on even the rights of workers. You think about the fees must fall as well, just how far the Wits University had gone to try and interdict the fees must fall movement, and essentially interdicting a hashtag even. And we've seen, for example, in Marikana as well, with the Marikana youth trying to essentially protest at the Teresa Mine to demand greater accountability with regards to the building of the units that the Marikana, the Teresa Mine had promised the workers around there and the community around there to say they're going to build houses. We've seen just how, you know, Teresa Mine would use, you know, the same tactic to interdict even the young people in Marikana from essentially even protesting at their institution. So I think for me, this is a growing trend that we're seeing in this country, and is actually essentially escalating into different forms and different, you know, shapes. And ultimately, what it seeks to do is to clamp down on dissent, is to essentially repress any voice, and essentially trying to block communities, trying to block activists, trying to block human rights defenders from essentially doing what we call popular mobilization in order to be able to fully partake in the processes that make decisions on behalf of the people of this country, you know, or on behalf of citizenry, or on behalf of the people in certain communities, in certain respects, or certain, groupings or interest groups in particular. So I think for me, it's something that is essentially gaining a whole lot of momentum. And it's something that is very worrying, primarily because when you're thinking about a democratic dispensation and essentially corporations having so much power to use our judicial systems to essentially clamp down on what we can do, what we can't do, to demand accountability and transparency, and quite frankly, to demand that we are part of the process that makes decisions on our behalf as communities, that's a very worrying factor. And one of the things that we ought to think about is, how do we engage with this process? How do we demand that this process essentially does not necessarily win in as far as keeping us quiet, keeping us subservient, in fact, you know, because we're almost dining at the table of deceit that is keeping us subservient instead of self-determined. Every time we try to raise up, every time we try and popularly mobilize in order to demand that we form part of the fiber of the discussions, of the decision-making, there's something that gets done through lawfare, and we get all kinds of interdicts. Sometimes we get sued in our own personal capacities. I mean, it's the same thing. I'm fighting a surveillance, company, and they trying to, sue me, intimidate me individually. Even though I work for R2K, they're not suing R2K. They're trying to sue me individually, as they see me as perhaps the vanguard of, or the knowledge holder of, anti-surveillance work. So as a result, they're trying to sue me to intimidate me out of that. And they're suing me for ridiculous amounts of money, probably say, in the range of millions and all sorts of things. And I think that has become a very common occurrence. And I think civil society needs to rally behind essentially saying, how else do we organize, mobilize in order to be able to effectively push back against this? And how do we engage perhaps with the judicial processes or the judicial system in this country to say, how can we have a dialogue? How can we put this into the public discourse, but also more or less have a dialogue with the judiciary to say, can we have an ear with you to simply see there is a political fight that has been waged that is using this institution to essentially undermine the rights of citizens, to undermine the rights of people in this country. And I think we have our work cut out in trying to essentially develop a sustainable campaign that would, one, raise awareness, two, mobilize civil society actors and mobilize lawyers or public interest defenders as well, and also engage at the policy level to say what needs to reform in order to ensure that there's a protection for us as activists, for environmental activists, for different kinds of activism that is actually emanating from communities, to ensure that we are protected, and the justice system in this country is not utilized to suppress dissenting voices. And I think for me, Nonhle made a beautiful point about how the political elite essentially play a role in facilitating such. And I think for me, there's this culture of entrenched political elite that is often using state institutions to protect mostly, and we've seen that with the kinds of corruption that has been emanating from the different provinces in the State Capture Commission. What that tells us is that the entrenched political elite essentially has interests in these corporations. They shareholders, they chairpersons, they all kinds of things. And sometimes they actually even given bribes to enable these corporations to do as they please. And I think that there's a big problem there to essentially say these political players would then utilize their influence and use state institutions to actually clamp down on dissent, to clamp down on any form of opposition to these multinationals doing as they please in our communities and in our different areas. And this is something that's hardly spoken about, in as much as we do the work to simply say, hold on, we will not be silenced, nothing about us without us, but also there's a facilitation process that happens through the political elite, the political influencers, and quite often people high up within the government structures, utilizing the state institutions to essentially have their way, because they're colluding with private corporations, and they stand to benefit. And I think we need to problematize that as much as we possibly can. That's not but the sole thing that we essentially looking at, but just to say holistically, when we look at the picture, we're going to have to speak the political language and essentially demand the political accountability as well, because it's but one thing to demand accountability from corporations, but we also need to demand accountability from these political role players. And I think for now I would leave it there, and my apologies if I'm sounding a bit hoarse. I've got a bit of a developing fever or flu. Yeah, sorry about that. I hope I was audible enough.
You were certainly audible, Tommy. I'm sorry you're not feeling well, but I mean, thank you for joining us, even though you're not feeling so well. Such incredible points, and such there has been so much of richness in what you've told us. The point about lawfare being in so many different kinds of forms, presenting itself in so many different forms, is exactly why I think we are having a little bit of a problem in South Africa in terms of identifying slaps and intimidation. Because are we collecting this data? Are we first recognizing that something is a slap suit? And are we collecting, collating, and analyzing this data? And we certainly hope that through the website, through the report bullying tool, that we'd be able to do some of this work. But I think one of the questions that you raise is, how do we engage with processes? How do we engage with a variety of processes that helps us to take this forward and for many people to be heard? And, the next panelist, Thandiwe Matthews, is a senior researcher, civil and political, in the Civil and Political Rights Program at the South African Human Rights Commission. And I'm really excited to hear from her in terms of, what is the work that the Human Rights Commission is doing to be able to allow people's voices to be heard, or to be able to look into the impact of repression, of slaps on human rights defenders in South Africa. Thandi, I'd like to hand over to you at this point. Again, please do have a look at Thandi's bio in the chat. Welcome, Thandi. We're looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Leanne, for allowing us as the Human Rights Commission the opportunity to participate in this very important webinar, and congratulations on the launch of your website, which we think It's an extremely important resource. Every year, the South African Human Rights Commission records thousands of complaints specifically related to alleged violations of civil and political rights. The Commission highlights in its 2018 report documenting the status of human rights defenders in South Africa that these violations relate to issues of personal privacy and surveillance, political violence, excessive use of force during protests, freedom of association, access to justice, just administrative action, and freedom of expression. The cross-cutting nature of these violations affects individuals and organizations working to advance civil, political, social, economic, and cultural rights in South Africa and contributes to the closing of political space. This has become increasingly more worrying as the country grapples to deal with the triple threat of unsustainable levels of inequality, high unemployment, and extreme forms of poverty. The Commission's report addressed the nuanced and multifaceted manner in which the state has failed to protect human rights defenders in South Africa, and particularly women human rights defenders, when exercising their rights to freedom of assembly, association and expression, access to information and public participation, combating corruption, advancing the rights of marginalized and vulnerable groups, and access to justice for human rights violations committed by both the state and non-state actors. Moreover, the report highlighted the failure of private actors and business to respect the rights of human rights defenders as required both in terms of the South African Constitution and regional and international law. The report further highlighted that non-state actors have the duty to respect human rights, including the rights of communities to freedom of assembly and association. Mining-affected communities continue to face systemic and complex challenges, such as non-compliance by holders of prospecting, mining, exploration, or production rights with the legal framework, including regulatory requirements and corporate social obligations, failures in compliance when it comes to monitoring and enforcement, insufficient consultation with interested and affected parties, a lack of transparency and limited access to information, limited cooperation and/or collaboration between mining companies, traditional authorities, local government and communities, the creation of tension and division within communities as a result of mining operations, as mentioned by Nontle, and limited development of social upliftment of communities affected by mining. However, human rights defenders seeking the promotion of human rights and holding non-state actors and private entities accountable for human rights violations, particularly with respect to environmental rights, are increasingly being met with threats and intimidation in various forms by private actors, including strategic litigation against public participation, or commonly referred to as slap suits. The Commission has noted that despite the development of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the state has yet to adopt a national action plan to mainstream the implementation of these principles in South Africa. The Commission has subsequently recommended that relevant state departments, such as the Department of Mineral Resources, should work together with voluntary private sector oversight bodies, such as the Business Leadership of South Africa, to provide annual reports of their members' compliance with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and that private entities should contribute to a fund to support human rights defenders, particularly those blowing the whistle on corrupt practices in both the private and public sector. In recent years, the Commission has emphasized its commitment to provide resource and capacity support and strengthen partnership relationships with key civil society stakeholders and human rights defenders to effectively address various human rights violations of common concern. The Sustainable Development Goals, specifically SDG 16, calls for the promotion of peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, providing access to justice for all, and the establishment of effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. SDG 16 identifies national human rights institutions, such as the Human Rights Commission, as core to ensuring that national institutions are strengthened, including through international cooperation for building capacity to prevent violence. To this end, the Commission has hosted domestic and regional workshops, together with the Southern African Human Rights Defenders Network, the International Commission of Jurists, and the Network of African National Human Rights Institutions on rights affecting human rights defenders in Southern Africa, including women human rights defenders and LGBTQI communities. Through its newly established National Preventive Mechanism, the Commission is also closely monitoring the human rights implications associated with the deprivation of liberty in places of detention. And this is the National Preventive Mechanism to monitor torture as per the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture. The Commission remains committed to deepening the democratic values enshrined in the Constitution and would like to emphasize the need for improved partnerships between all stakeholders, including civil society and national government, in developing and enforcing policy and legislation that creates and maintains a safe and enabling environment in which human rights defenders can operate and contribute to the promotion and protection of civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. Thank you so much, Leanne.
Thank you so much, Thandi. You know, the Commission has done so much work in terms of trying to really grapple with this issue. And one of the things I'm hearing you say is that in spite of the UN Guiding Principles, we still don't have a national action plan. And perhaps, you know, there are so many civil society organizations and individuals, community members that are on this call today. And perhaps, you know, one of the things we take away is that should we be working more closely to be able to develop or call for this action plan to participate more fully in some of the work that the Commission is doing? Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think, you know, I think it's really important, especially in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, to actively work with your domestic national human rights institutions and to understand the roles and responsibilities of the infrastructure that we have in terms of our Constitution in order to protect the rights, particularly of vulnerable and marginalized groups. So how we come about using the existing resources also requires a lot of engagement and networking, active communication between all stakeholders, regardless of the tensions that may emerge. And I think also to be able to willing to engage with tension, because often through the robust debate, we are able to then come up with solutions that we can all buy into. So resources such as the website that you guys have just launched as the Center for Environmental Rights, it's really helpful for us as the Commission to endorse the work, but to also have a consolidated archive of experiences, especially for institutions that don't have direct access to community. So we thank you for all the work that you are also doing. It makes all of our lives a lot easier. Thank you.
Thank you, Thandi. Thank you. So much insight in your presentation as well. And we will certainly be following up on some of these key points in terms of how to galvanize a civil society and share information in a much more meaningful, efficient way. Thank you, Thandi. And speaking about the kinds of rights that are necessary, the exercise of the rights that are necessary to allow activists to do this work, so much of it is about protest and protests that are allowed to take place in whichever space, that they need to take place in. And we have Stanley Malamatia from the Right to Protest, housed at the Center for Applied Legal Studies, also a steering committee member for the Southern African Human Rights Defenders Network, which I mentioned briefly in my introduction. And Stanley, as the lead attorney for the Right to Protest project, as well as being on the steering committee for the Human Rights Defenders Network, what strategies are in place to empower human rights defenders in respect of resisting SLAP and ensuring physical protection as well? And why is it so important that we all kind of work together in the space to ensure that rights are protected?
Sure. Thanks, Leanne. And thank you for having us as the Right to Protest project. And I just want to say thank you to the panelists that came before me. You know, they've really said a mouthful. And I don't want to, add or even dilute what they have said. But, in responding to your question, let me begin by saying that the constitutional right to protest, this is a gateway right that allows people to come together into solidarity or even challenge something. So, apart from being a right that exerts pressure, it is also a right that allows people to have access to their other constitutionally guaranteed human rights. You know, a single voice is likely to be drowned in our polity, whereas in a choir, in a protest, you know, the message, people are able to get their message across. Now, the right to protest, as the Right to Protest Project has observed, it's one of the most endangered rights, in that it is endangered both from the criminal justice system sector and also in the civil sector, as civil law sector, right? So on the part of the criminal justice system is that oftenly we see the use of the common law offense of public violence as one of those charges that are prevalent. And I can tell you this, that charge is not there to secure a conviction. The charge is merely there to suppress and to intimidate activists to engage in protests. Now, when we move to the civil law part of it, what we come across, of course, we come across SLAP suits, right? And my colleagues have already, given a detailed presentation of what SLAP suits are. But perhaps we must remind ourselves, what are the characteristics? How does one really pick up that this is a SLAP suit? Number one, it is brought on an urgent basis. Number two, there's always costs that are asked in the case of a challenge. So the reason why it is brought on an urgent basis is that these corporate giants, number one, they know that people the victims, although their right to access to courts is guaranteed to everyone, it needs resources. That's number one. So it is a battle of resources. They know that these people do not have resources. That's why they approach the court on an urgent basis, right? Now, the second thing is to intimidate the respondents in the matter with costs, to say, Leanne, an urgent application has been granted against you so that you stop from doing 1, 2, 3. And should you wish to challenge this, you are going to bear the cost of the litigation. We know the cost of the litigation. They don't come at a low price. Even with us in civil society organizations, we are donor funded. So immediately when we jump into cases, we first think about the costs. That is something that we always have at the back of our heads. So there is a battle of resources between lawyers in the civil society sector and lawyers in the private sector. Now, so now what then this makes is that these cases, are brought strategically just to strain, activists. And, in a democratic country, when we see the rise of activists, it means that there's a lack of political will. Nontle, painted it out clearly, how our politicians are colluding and how our state institutions, those very same state institutions that are meant to protect the people, how, they are colluding to be the tool of oppression against activists, right? Then we also have a situation whereby civil society organizations, the likes of Center for Applied Legal Studies, the likes of CER, right? Our top mandate, or rather our strategic view of attending to these issues, it is through strategic litigation, And here's the thing, the shortfall with strategic litigation is that it is only good insofar as it comes to challenging and developing the law. But insofar as it comes to changing the behavior of our officials, then it falls short of that. And in SLAP suits, unfortunately, the issue is not about the law that's in place. The issue is about our political leaders. The issue is about implementation of those particular laws. So within the Right to Protest project, and also at the let me start with the Right to Protest project. So with the Right to Protest project, we have seen the need of protesters, that protesters need support on the ground. So that's why the Right to Protest project, operates a toll-free line. We have a hotline where people are just able to phone in, if they require assistance insofar as their constitutional right to protest is concerned. And this even extends to when people get arrested. So our main aim is to provide, bail services to them, right? Because we have noticed that the criminal justice system is being used as a tool of oppression, and just an arrest, an arrest on its own, just being 24 hours or even 5 hours in a police holding cell, that can do a lot of damage to the psychological well-being of an activist. And we have also noticed that when we take these matters to court, in most cases these matters are non-prosecutable. So you can tell that these charges are merely brought just to intimidate activists. So and also we have we have also observed how the constitutional right to protest has been undermined. Here we shouldn't be naive to the fact that we are dealing with a government that itself used the constitutional, or rather the right to protest, in order to get where it is right now, right? So it knows all the power that comes with the constitutional right to protest. So now what our government has done is that, they would deliberately ignore activists. They will deliberately ignore communities, so that once communities start getting frustrated, engage in civil disobedience, what the government likes to term as violent protest, right? Then they pounce on them. Then once they pounce on them, they then turn them into criminals, as opposed to letting them be activists. So right now, as a country, we are presented with a picture that activists are criminals, because it is the government that it ignores them until they get to a certain point. People would protest peacefully, people would give in memorandums of demands, and when those demands are not met, and people are left with little but no choice to engage in civil disobedience. In our report as the Right to Protest Project, in our 2019 report, where we look at the state of protest in South Africa, is that we have engaged in a comparative analysis between labor-related protest and service delivery-related protest, or protests which are mostly engaged by activists. Is that what we have found is that in labor-related protest, why they always go, smoothly or peacefully, is that employees actually have the bargaining hand. They have the choice of withdrawing the labor, therefore making the employer feel pain without engaging in any, conduct that might be deemed to be civil disobedience. On the other hand, when you look at service delivery protest, what do we expect that a person must do? A person who's protesting for water, what is it that we expect that person to do if the government is ignoring that person? That's why we see in most cases how protesters would resort to blocking the road. They are just believing in that if I disturb motorists, then maybe the government will attend to me. But that is a trap that the government has set up, to say that immediately when they engage in that conduct, then they arrest them, then they stop from being activists and they become criminals. So now in terms of the Southern African Human Rights Defenders Network Fund, is that also they, when the fund was being developed, is that we saw the need that not only are activists or human rights defenders, arbitrarily criminalized, not only are they hit with slap suits, right? Is that they are being threatened. Their lives are at risk. Their lives are in danger. So what the fund does is that it allows applications from human rights defenders whose lives are in threat, to apply for a fund. And this fund, because it's only starting now and it also has limited resources, is that it can only go to a certain capacity. Maybe we try to relocate that certain activist, to a different area so that the waters can cool down a little. But sometimes, our strategy of also relocating the activist to a certain area, it can also be a disadvantage, because activism can only be that powerful if someone is within the area where the things are happening. Activism cannot happen where the activist is in another place and the issues are happening at a different location. So with that also, there are gaps in what we are trying to do, but as we go on, we try to develop strategies to try and fill in those gaps, And also, if I can just end by saying that also with slap suits, there's a serious gap in the judiciary. Is that with a slap suit, it is only a slap suit, to be quite honest, it is only a slap suit to us, the activists and the lawyers representing the activists. But in all honesty, when the matter goes to court, the court sees an application for defamation. So, and our judicial system is so rigid that it only deals with what is before it. So therefore, as lawyers, we are forced to make arguments on SLAP suit only in passing. So we are not allowed to go into detail. And that's why this issue of SLAP suit persists, because the court does not deal with the SLAP suit in front of it. And what it has done also to the lawyers, I mean, CER, right? The lawyers from CER are having this battle where they are being sued personally. So now we are seeing this SLAP suit also being used as a strategy to conflate or also negate the fact that lawyers are creatures of instruction, right? And because of our judiciary is so rigid, we are unable also to make those arguments because the application before the court is a defamation application. It is not a SLAP suit defamation. It is not an application where creatures of instruction are being confused with activists. So there's a lot of gaps. There's a lot of gaps insofar as SLAPs are concerned. But engaging in such webinars, it assists us to try and find the remedies and also like practical solutions that we can use to fill up those gaps. Yeah.
Thanks, Stanley. Again, so much to learn from in terms of strategies and tactics and what are the kind of key issues we need to try and address. You've got the issues with the legal provisions and how to be able to address that. You've got the gaps in terms of the criminal justice system, being able to properly have right to protest protected in South Africa, as you are doing, such an incredible work that you're doing. Stanley, there is a question for you in the chat from Manson Gwanyanya from the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. Can I ask you, Stanley, to please respond to Manson through the chat function? We are running a little bit over time.
All right.
And we try and field additional questions at the end where we can. But I want to quickly take us into a somewhat more a different space and shift the emphasis into the global nature of our partnerships. I think we've all seen how such an important part of this campaign is connecting local actors as well as global actors in trying to address SLAP. This is the power of the campaign, really. It's to the work that everyone is doing, such important work in different spaces. And the global partnerships that we've been able to develop as part of the Asina Loyiko campaign have been incredible. We've learned so much. And it's also really important because, as we know, a lot of the SLAP suits that occur across the world occur as a result of multinational corporations, who operate in various jurisdictions across the world. So being able to understand what the strategies are globally and learn from one another is incredibly important. So I want to move into what is happening from a global perspective and start with Nikhil Dutta, who's from the International Center for Nonprofit Law. He's the legal advisor on global programs at ICNL. He advises on multilateral engagement, including through United Nations processes and activities under the Open Government Partnership, and has importantly conducted research on issues of the global scope affecting the legal environment for civil society, such as strategic litigation against public participation. Nikhil, I know that there has been a report that ICNL has released quite recently. Do you want to tell us about the report, the type of SLAPs that you've come across, the key lessons that we can learn in terms of addressing SLAPs?
Sure, thanks so much, Leanne, and thanks again to the Center for inviting me to speak today, and congratulations on the launch of the Asina Loyiko website. This is going to be an incredibly valuable resource. If I could just briefly also say thank you so much to Nonchale for that really powerful presentation and for her courageous work to defend communities from corporate abuses. And also thanks to the previous panelists. I've learned so much from your presentation. I'll try to be brief in answering Leanne's question. So ICNL issued a report earlier this year, which presents a survey of reported instances of SLAPs, cases that have been identified as SLAPs in relevant reporting in the Global South. And that also presented an analysis of anti-SLAPP responses that have been implemented in the Global North and the Global South. Our goal was to shed light on SLAPPs that are being filed in the Global South, which have received less attention than SLAPPs filed in some jurisdictions of the Global North, and also to encourage learning between jurisdictions about what effective policy responses to SLAPPs look like. So in terms of what kinds of cases we saw in our sample of reported SLAPPs, first of all, the SLAPPs that we identified were concentrated in a few regions, and one of those was South Africa. South Africa is a leading jurisdiction in terms of SLAPPs being filed, especially by developers and mining companies. Second, about 80% of the SLAPPs that we found were filed against activists, civil society organizations, journalists, publishers, members of local communities, really trying to focus on suppressing the right to speech and participation of communities and civil society. And again, about 80% of the SLAPPs in our sample focused on trying to suppress environmental and environmental health advocacy or advocacy with respect to human rights and labor rights abuses. So the threat that SLAPPs poses to the exercise of fundamental freedoms and advocacy on critically important issues in the Global South is really important. And it suggests the need to engage in a variety of responses to push back against SLAPPs. Some of those are responses that are already being pushed in South Africa and by Asina Loyiko, pushing for mutual defense and awareness raising, advocacy with investors. Because ICNL really focuses on policy responses in a legal framework, we identified a few key important in pushing back against SLAPPs. First, about 90% of the cases were based on criminal or civil defamation charges, which really suggests the importance of trying to reform defamation law to prevent its abuse in SLAPP suits. And these kinds of reforms can involve eliminating criminal defamation liability and also providing immunity from defamation liability for communications on matters of public interest. So when you're speaking on issues of public interest, you shouldn't have to face the possibility of a defamation lawsuit. Because what you're talking about is issues that are of critical importance to the public. Second of all, it's really important in successful responses to SLAPPs in both the Global North and the Global South have really focused on getting SLAPPs out of court as early as possible, because the longer that a SLAPP is in court, the more resources, the more time, the more money, and the more emotional capital that the SLAPP target needs to expend trying to defend against it. So expedited dismissal procedures are really important in pushing back against SLAPPs. And those procedures should be easy to initiate by both defendants and by judges and prosecutors. And they should place the burden on the person who brought the SLAPP of trying to show why the case should go forward. And if they can't show that the case is meritorious, then the case should be kicked out of court. I will just say last that ICNL has issued a call for proposals to support projects that are aimed at pushing back against SLAPPs in the Global South. And I'll insert the link in the chat function. That call for proposals is open until October 31st, and we encourage anyone interested in applying to apply to that. You can also find our report through that link as well. Thanks so much again to the center and to all the.
Thank you so much, Nikki. You'll be pleased to know that we have the link to your call for proposals on the website as part of the resources available to civil society activists. And again, you know, we really need to kind of be able to accumulate these resources so as to better defend ourselves. So that's incredibly important. Nikki, I think that the work that the ICNL is doing in terms of being able to really deal with this from a strategic perspective is really important. So thank you. I want to now move over to understanding a perspective from Charlie Holt, legal counsel at Greenpeace. Charlie supports the food and forest campaigns at Greenpeace International and advises on anti-SLAPP strategy. Charlie, you've been involved in defending several SLAPP suits. You have, Greenpeace has released so many reports trying to identify SLAPP suits in various parts of the world, as well as present strategies. What are the legal and advocacy strategies that you have found to be important and effective?
Thank you so much, Leanne. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm going to do something quite risky here and put my technological ineptitude on full display by trying to get my screen to work and to share the screen. You have to tell me whether or not this does indeed work.
I will, don't worry.
And whether or not you can see my presentation as opposed to my, yes, can you see just the presentation?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. So we at Greenpeace International really started working proactively on SLAP resilience after we, as you said, Leanne, were ourselves hit by 2 large-scale aggressive SLAPs in 2016 and 2017, respectively. I'm not going to go into lots of detail about these, but I think it's helpful to provide some background by way of context to the question you posed. So one of these lawsuits was filed by a Canadian logging company called Resolute, and the other one was by the owner and operator of the Dakota Access Pipeline in North Dakota in the US. And they had a number of striking similarities that it's worth going. And I think a lot of these will be familiar to people on this call, given what's already been said. They were both filed by the same law firm, a law firm which proudly boasted of its aggressive credentials. In fact, if you go onto their website, you'll see it littered with all sorts of boxing metaphors. But both used the same law. It was an anti-racketeering law, and they applied this law by treating our advocacy activity as being inherently criminal in nature. So in one of those cases, they were claiming our communications were extortive, constituted extortion, and the other one saying that they constituted incitement. And finally, and I think this is something that we see quite a lot, they used a number of the same intimidation tactics, 2 in particular here. They pursued individuals as well as organizations. I think this is what Tammy was saying about, pursuing him and not just the organization, and excessive damages. So together they were demanding over $1 billion. So we realized that we needed to develop a broader SLAP strategy. And one of the first things we recognized was that the best type of response to SLAPs was one that integrated legal, campaign and advocacy strategies. So one which brought these things together. And apologies for my terrible design abilities. There you go, together into one integrated response strategies. And there are 2 main reasons for this integrated strategy, which I think helped inform the strategies we pursued. And I'll put this here. The first of these was a defensive consideration. And it was quite simply that SLAP plaintiffs often tend to marginalize, discredit, and isolate their targets from civil society more broadly. And the reason for this is simple. If you're going to pursue an NGO, or you're going to pursue an activist, or indeed anyone whose job it is to hold the powerful to account, you first need to undermine the perceived legitimacy of their role as a public watchdog. We heard exactly this from Nonchla earlier when she spoke about the way that she had been smeared as anarchists along with other activists. And we've seen similar comments on the panel on the side of this conversation along the way. In our case, it was really quite classic. Resolute smeared us in a number of times in the lawsuit as being an outlier, as being a rogue environmental group, which they then contrasted with so-called responsible environmental organizations. So again, trying to separate us from broader civil society. So often with SLAPs, it's important to put together a robust defense, not just in the courts, but in relation to public opinion. I think this is also one of the reasons why it's so important to build solidarity across civil society, and why anti-SLAP coalitions like Protect the Protests in the US and Asina Loyiko in South Africa are so important. They send a clear signal to SLAP litigants that civil society will not be divided, that it will not be possible to isolate individual actors in civil society. This in turn really makes sure that the conditions needed for SLAPs to emerge don't take root. The second reason for this integrated response strategy was an offensive consideration. And that was that to defeat a SLAP, it's not enough for that lawsuit to simply misfire. It has to actively backfire. I think however strong a legal defense is, the best it can ever do is to accelerate the dismissal of the lawsuit. Most SLAPs are not filed with the expectation that they're going to prevail in court anyway. It's the litigation process which SLAP litigants are interested in. So therefore, they win if that litigation process is sufficiently painful for the defendant to make them retract their criticism. And they lose, therefore, if that same process backfires and becomes more painful for the plaintiff than it is for the defendant. So the question is, how does it backfire? And I think if the SLAP is filed in an attempt to suppress corporate wrongdoing, then the answer is quite obvious. It backfires when that corporate wrongdoing is magnified as a result of the lawsuit. And that's why a campaign which amplifies the nature of the SLAP as being a case of corporate bullying, and even better, which amplifies the original criticism that was challenged in the lawsuit, that's why that does so much, not just to fight off the SLAP, but just discourage the use of SLAPs in the future. It really changes the equation for those who use it. In fact, there are a number of cases here in Europe where a really vigorous advocacy campaign has actually led to complaints being withdrawn altogether. There's a very, I think, an interesting case of where Some of Us, an advocacy group, which was based in Germany, was sued there after a protest outside the headquarters of PayPal, which they were campaigning against what they saw as the facilitation of funds to neo-Nazi groups. It launched such an energetic campaign with social media posts, with YouTube videos and so on, that not only was the campaign dropped, but PayPal actually ended up changing its policy in line with the original demands. Now, of course, one of the interesting dynamics here is that there are obvious legal reasons why SLAP defendants are not going to feel inclined to speak out. It's often seen as legally counterintuitive. And that's another reason why it's so important that legal and advocacy strategies are pursued in tandem. The more confident you can be that your position is legally robust, the more vocal you can be in responding to the plaintiff. And of course, the more vocal you are in responding to the plaintiff, the more likely you are to beat off the SLAP. So just to finish off, this is one of the webinars that we had in Protect the Protest, which says roughly what I was saying before. And I'll just finish by saying that I'm so conscious that none of this will be new to the Center for Environmental Rights for Asina Loyiko in general. The Asina Loyiko campaign has really been a masterclass in how to do all of this, everything I've been saying. So I feel very humbled to present this to you all today, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Charlie. And you know, the kind of line that you have there, you know, shout to the rooftop, on the rooftops, that you will fight back. You know, this is so much of what we're trying to do, just combine the legal strategies with the advocacy strategies, and really just amplify the resistance. You know, we will certainly try and make your presentation, which is so clear and so simple, available on our website, if that's going to be possible. But really, thank you for that reflection. And again, you know, we have just a couple of minutes to go. So I want to check in with all the panelists in terms of their closing thoughts. We wanted to have, and Lady Yaramilo from the Business and Human Rights Resource Center was supposed to join us for the last part of this presentation, but is having some connection issues. So I want to see if Manson from BHHRC is available to reflect. Oh, Lady, I see that you are here. Lady, would you be able to very quickly take us through, you know, the importance of us being able to collect data, analyze that data, and be able to then use that in our campaign strategies. And then we will take final thoughts from the rest of our panel members before closing. Lady, over to you.
Hello, hear me now?
Yes, yes,
okay,
we can.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Lilian, for the opportunity to be here today. I was used, but finally I could manage all of them. So for the Resource Center, it's a pleasure to be here. Congratulations on the launch and for all of the incredible work you are doing to fight SLAPs. So I'm just be very quick and share that for us is so important having this kind of having the opportunity to share information and to to share information, because we think this is a way to raise awareness about the SLAPs at the local, regional, and international levels. This is why this campaign, this anti-SLAPs campaign, is so important for us, and it's also a way to visualize different histories and to give voice to the defenders affected and so on. So at the Resource Center, we have been tracking attacks against human rights defenders in 2015. And we identified that the SLAPs was one of the most common legal strategies used by debate actors. So for this reason, last year, we start doing a deep research on SLAPs. And we have been collecting cases and information from different regions. And we are planning to launch a public database with cases and a centralized hub of data about the globally, and some analysis about trends by April next year. So I think our resources are going to be on your website, and we are so excited to be part of this important campaign. And we just have identified some similarities between regions, and I already shared some of their findings in the regions, and particularly in the Global South. But I just wanted to highlight that we see that this is very common in different regions. So it's attacking used in different regions, and we see that the Americas and Africa are most regions, particularly South Africa. And it is important, the use of criminal complaints in the Global South that is quite different from, for example, North America and Europe, where the SLAPs are related to civil complaints. So we have been able to identify some trends and some similarities in terms of the regions, but we plan to launch our database and all the information next year. So I really apologize because I was having these troubles, but I'm more than happy to share some of our strategies, other trends that we are seeing in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lady. We're really looking forward to the launch of that, the report with the data collection next year, and certainly we will host it on the website. We already have resources from all the organizations that are represented through panelists here today, and we're incredibly grateful for all the work that you've done so far to make the campaigns work a little bit easier in terms of the development of strategies. We just have a few minutes left, and I have we have a question from Thabo Maele, and I would like maybe Tommy or Stanley to answer this question before we close out and take some final very brief comments from everyone. And Thabo's question is, for those that are living in rural areas and are being fined by traditional leaders for disturbing peace in their land, what kind of advice or resource that could you direct him to?
Okay, Leon. I think that's the perhaps I may not necessarily answer the question, but to further problematize it, to say we have a two-tier system in this country where there's a broader apex, law in the land, that is the Constitution, and the, the legislation that flows off. I'm thinking about the Regulations of Gatherings Act, for example, that sort of seeks to govern the manner in which we assemble and petition. But then there's communities that live under traditional authority. And essentially what then happens is that the traditional authority essentially thinks that the apex apex law in that context, right? Now there's constantly all these tensions, and I mean, I'm sure comrades would remember there is what we call the traditional courts bill and how problematic that has been, particularly for enabling democracy in rural areas. And essentially, this is another, I would say this is another problem that is, subjecting particularly rural communities to all kinds of, manner of different, interpretation of the role of the law and all sorts of things. So I think for me is to further problematize it. I may not necessarily have an answer, but what you would expect is that no traditional authority will oversee or should have a say on how people assemble, protest, and petition, irrespective of where they are in this country. So to start with, no traditional authority or no traditional leader has actually the authority to trample on the right that's enshrined in the Constitution to protest, for example. So it shouldn't be happening at all. But like I'm saying, uniquely in this country, you then have a two-tier system where you have a particular law that enables or gives certain powers to traditional authorities, particularly in rural areas, to essentially think that they are law unto themselves. And I think those are the tensions that we also have to try and navigate, given the fact that in our context, we have activists, in peri-urban areas and urban areas, as well as what, folks like, or comrades like Nontle in the traditional areas. And these are some of the tensions that we also have to navigate. And I think strategically moving forward, we need to think about how best do we then interact with these, with these processes, and how best do we interact with these happenings that are essentially happening on the ground to be able to kind of fight for a much more comprehensive redress, because I think that's the other tension that we have to also navigate. But just maybe say the bottom line is no traditional authority has authority over whether people can protest or not. But then there's these tensions, with our laws and our policies, given that there's this traditional, this traditional courts bill, and there's also the Constitution as well. And it's constant tensions. It's the same in municipalities. Most municipalities misinterpret the Regulations of Gatherings Act, and they assume that we must ask for permission if we want to protest. And the truth of the matter is that this is a constitutional right. We don't have to ask for permission. All we do is notify them in order for us to protest. Their responsibility is to ensure that this protest is policed, is peaceful, and people are actually, within the confines of the law. But the interpretation in municipalities is to say, we hold the right on whether to authorize or not to authorize. And these are the tensions that we have to exacerbate and actually put into the public discourse. And our fight is much bigger. I would leave it there.
Yeah, no, thanks, Tommy. I think, there are so many complexities that we're having to negotiate in terms of the work that we're doing. We've heard through the chat from Bill and Gary and Rose how environmental specialists are being influenced, by corporations in particular, and I mean, that is just hugely worrying. I maybe just want to give everyone a minute or so, just final thoughts and reflections. Stanley, maybe starting with you.
Sure. Thank you, Leanne. And thank you to everyone, all the panelists. I think I've learned a lot today. I think in closing, I would like to say, we need to work together collectively to find, practical solutions to these issues, because the lives of human rights defenders are at a risk. And if our human rights defenders are wiped out, we are, equally wiped out, because they are fighting to protect the very same environment, that gives us life. So we really need to come together. We really need to work to find the practical solutions. And I think, learn from each other as well, learn from different regions. And I think in the region of South Africa, I think we really need to find something that really fosters and advocates for political will, because, the resources are there, the mechanisms are there, but we know in South Africa, we are lacking the political will. So we really need to break that boundary. And I believe that, our panelists from different regions of the world will be of a good assistance. And I think the platform that you've set up as well, Asina, Loyiko, I think it will also, you asked the question of how do we collect data? I think we are having our first step of collecting that through the website that you've created. So I really thank you for that.
Thanks so much, Stanley. Such a succinct way to sum up, some of the things we've been discussing today. Thandi, I want to move over to you and just final thoughts and closing comments.
Thank you so much, Leanne. So I think just building on what Stanley has said and your previous presentations about the importance of legal mobilization alongside strategic advocacy, I think something that I've learned in my time working in the human rights space is that I don't think we use our resources effectively. And I think projects such as the one that you have just launched is a start for us to pool all of our data and our resources so that we don't kind of do double the amount of work. I think something that was very important that Stanley mentioned was that litigation is very costly. And SLAP suits, ironically, don't only cost human rights defenders, they also cost the state as the primary duty bearer of rights realization, right? So something that I think, through the work that I try and do, is to not only lobby the work of civil society, but also to encourage civil society to use the recommendations emanating from Human Rights Commission reports, because we know that in the regional and international space, recommendations flowing from your Chapter 9 institutions kind of complement and strengthen the claims that are being made. We saw that what happened, with the whole debacle with the public protector, for example, a huge reason why the public protector's recommendations became as effective as what they were is because political parties were using the recommendations from the commission to lobby their own agendas, right? So we need to start using our resources more effectively rather than assuming that our public bodies need to do all the work, because we can't do that work on our own, right? We need to kind of work collectively in order to ensure that the recommendations from Chapter 9 institutions do have the weight that they are supposed to have in order to advance political will, as Stanley had mentioned, towards the advancement of human rights. And then just one last point is that because of the Sustainable Development Goals and the impetus that has been placed, especially on state institutions, to build a culture of human rights through the advancement of SDG 16, we need to start working with state bureaucrats to, I think, I wouldn't say improve, but kind of work with their rights consciousness. So how do state bureaucrats understand their roles and responsibilities when it comes to advancing the realization of human rights as per their mandate? I know that that methodology isn't always embraced sometimes by activism, but we need to start seeing, we don't need to always see the state as kind of the adversary, but have kind of this idea that the state isn't a monolith, and there are people working within our state institutions that are committed towards the advancement of human rights in our country. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Thandi. Collective working together on these issues is so crucial. Nikki, can we move over to you, and then Charlie and Lady?
Yeah, I would just really briefly stress the importance of, first of all, awareness raising in order to, I think developing more awareness amongst the public of this threat is crucial to any kind of effective SLAP response, whether it's trying to increase the reputational consequences for those who file SLAPs, as Charlie was discussing, or trying to support effective policy responses. And then second, to echo what Thandi has said, I think in tandem with public awareness raising, it's really important to try to identify potential allies in the government and in the bureaucracy, and to try to work with them to craft effective policy responses to SLAPs, because I think, as many of the panelists have said, it's really critical to try to change the legal framework that allows this kind of abusive litigation to go forward. And that requires working with legislators and with government officials in order to accomplish those changes.
Thanks, Nikki. Charlie?
Thanks, Leanne. Again, thank you so much for letting me join you today. I do think this is such an important initiative, I said, and I don't want to just repeat what others have said far more succinctly than I have, but I do think it's worth reinforcing this idea of solidarity as being so important. The calculation that SLAP litigants make is based on the fundamental imbalance of power between them and the SLAP target. And that equation fundamentally changes when the target is no longer just one individual activist, but is civil society at large. And the only other thing I would say before closing is that it's just to think about how wide that can potentially be. So SLAPs affect all public watchdogs, all those whose job it is to hold the powerful to account. And that can encompass whistleblowers, it encompass journalists, it can encompass advocacy groups, individual activists, and so on. And I think the wider and more diverse the coalition, the more powerful the ability to fight back, and the further the reach that you can, with which you can undermine the message of the SLAP litigant.
Thanks, Charlie. Lady?
Thank you, Leanne. So I agree with everything that was said. I just want to add that it's so important to work with other stakeholders. For instance, investors, companies, and even prosecutors and judges, because at the end they are the ones who decided the SLAP. So I think it's so important to promote trainings to human rights and to provide our input to the government in order to take different steps to protect human rights defenders. But I also think it is so important, since many of the organizations and defenders usually publish information report. I think it's also crucial to seek advice from libel lawyers, and this is maybe somehow our recommendations for the civil society. So just receive this advice from libel lawyers in order to maybe avoid any kind of libel risks. And also, I think it's so important to maybe support, to give the voice, like to promote this awareness, but sharing histories, because many of the histories we don't know. At least in Latin America, this is something that we don't know. So I want not only to work on regional coalitions, but also to work in international coalition, to understand these differences and these similarities, and try to maybe promote joint campaigns, like global campaigns, to promote anti-SLAPs legislation or other laws to protect human rights defenders.
Thanks so much, Lady, and thank you so much to everyone who's participated today. I think this has been such an incredible discussion today. And yes, the resistance is real, it is resourced, and it will continue to hold corporations accountable wherever they may be. And we gather strength from one another in this campaign. And I'm so grateful to all my colleagues who are here on this call today, and all those who are supporting us and have supported us throughout the campaign. Yeah, and yeah, I hope you will use the website, you will contact us with questions, with advice, anything really. We're depending on you to make this as an effective website as possible. So thank you, everyone. That's the end of our session today. Thank you for sticking with us, even though we went a little bit over time, and we will certainly be in touch with you as the campaign moves forward in strength.